What's going on, Hawks fans? It's Caleb Johnson here with you with Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson's episode number one. I've been really excited about this for quite some time of having this avenue, this ability to talk with you guys on a what is going to be right now a weekly basis that will expand as we get further into the NBA season. Now, I'm someone who has been for the last few years covering the Atlanta Hawks on a pretty regular basis for 92.9 The Game here in Atlanta, and have grown to get to know this team, get to know players, coaches, front office staff, all that sort of thing. And so I feel like I sit with information that I get to share oftentimes on my radio show on 92.9 The Game, the Dopey Millennial Show. But it's nice to have this Hawks specific, this basketball specific podcast that I can bring to you guys on a regular basis, that we can have some fun. We can dive into the nitty gritty, the minutia that's going on with the team right now. But the overall theme is this to be a laid back space, a not so. I'm gonna get into the specifics and the numbers at times, but we're not going to live there. We're also not going to just live entirely with the drama of the NBA because, yes, the NBA can be a very dramatic sport, and is coming off fresh of having spoken with Hawks' new GM Onsi Saleh. There's plenty of drama that you could make from all of these sorts of things, but I want to live somewhere in the middle of all of these sorts of things of dealing with the stats, and the what is actually happening on the court, what's actually happening off the court, and kind of mixing everything together, apart from the things that I see as a reporter, because I'm able to be at press conferences, I'm able to be at practices, I'm able to hear discussions all over the place, and I want to have a platform to be able to bring all of that information to you guys. And so that's the plan with Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson. I know not the most original name possible, but as my buddy Joe Patrick, fellow 99 The Game podcaster, said, it cleared legal. And so that's what's important here. So I want to spend this initial episode kind of getting into what is the latest going on with this team right now, which there is a lot. Like, for it being the off season, and for it being a period in which there might not be necessarily a ton going on. It's not like there's been some blockbuster trade, as there have been with, you think of the Houston Rockets, who just traded for Kevin Durant. You think of the Orlando Magic just trading for Desmond Bane. Like, the Hawks don't necessarily have that going on, but they do have this upcoming NBA draft happening on Wednesday of this week. This is going to be a pivotal time for this team. And so, without any further ado, I want to get into those things of what the expectations are coming this week, what the expectations are kind of moving forward in the future. This is not going to be some 3-hour podcast or anything like that. I do want to keep this somewhat brief, but dive into kind of the most pressing issues that are going on with this team right now. And I'll begin with what just happened earlier today. I'm still in my polo shirt from the press conference that the Atlanta Hawks had, where General Manager Onsi Saleh came out and spoke to all of us reporters, and it was a full house, which I guess kind of surprised maybe some within the Hawk staff that initially tried to have this format in a smaller setup and then had to expand it because there was a lot of us there ready to talk to the new general manager. This was the first time that we were able to talk to someone in the front office from the Hawks since, I believe, April, like since we had exit interviews with Landry Fields, where he gave a breakdown of a lot of different things that were going on with this team, expectations that we had going into the offseason, and then boom, I'm sitting in the movie theater watching Sinners, and I get a text that Landry Fields has been fired, and that the plan moving forward is for Onsi Saleh, the assistant GM, who came from the Warriors organization, who spent some time with the Spurs organization. Onsi Saleh is now going to be the new general manager, and the plan back in April was for this team to hire a president of basketball operations. Well, folks, it's now June, and that still hasn't happened. And so we got some insight earlier today in the fact that this is going to be essentially Onsi Saleh's show moving forward. He had no new information, he said, when he spoke to us reporters about the president of basketball operations search. He just knew that, hey, for right now, I'm making all the decisions. And this is something that I had been actually saying for quite some time. When I made radio appearances, when I was brought on other places, like Sports Extra on 11 Alive, I mentioned the fact that it was very likely this team was not going to hire a president of basketball operations, simply because you don't normally hire people underneath you and then hire the boss. Like, the boss usually is the one making all the decisions, like who's going to be my assistants, who is going to be my coach, all of that sort of a thing. So to have the team somewhat in place, to have the coach somewhat in place, to have the front office outside of that president in place, it didn't make a whole lot of sense for them to bring in that position. And it was one of those, unless you just got absolutely wowed by any particular candidate, and I certainly didn't think that was going to happen, especially when you start hearing names like Danny Ferry coming up, which this organization has a disdain for because of the embarrassment he brought on the organization in the past. When all of that sort of thing came up, it was like, yeah, the most likely scenario is that this team is going to go without a president of basketball operations, that Onsi Saleh, the general manager, is going to be the decision maker moving forward. He essentially verified all of that thought process for us when we spoke to him. And so it's like, okay, now we can move on from there. There were a lot of different discussions that were brought up over the course of time of talking with Onsi that I found relatively interesting. I've got a few different video clips that I want to bring to your attention. Now, I do have to preface, for those of you who are watching this on video, this is my first time messing with all of these sorts of things. So it might be clunky this first time around, but I promise we're going to get it figured out. If you're listening on the audio end of this, apologies for even having to explain all of that, because it might just seem seamless on your end. We shall see. But I thought one of the most pressing issues going on with the Atlanta Hawks is always going to be the uncertainty of Trae Young. Of, is this a guy you can win with? Is this a guy you want leading your team moving forward? I have been someone who's been very open about the fact that I don't think you can necessarily win with Trae Young being your best player, but that certainly doesn't mean that he's someone that you just automatically need to trade and get rid of. You have built this team around Trae Young for quite some time. Maybe not done it so particularly well, but you certainly, with the pieces that you've put around, have built this thing up for a guy with Trae Young's scoring ability. And if he goes out the door, man, you've got a lot to fill in the gaps. And we've seen that at times when Trae Young hasn't been available. Even going back to the days of DeJounte Murray being around here, where it worked for a little bit, but not really in the long haul. You need Trae Young's scoring ability, and his passing ability for that fact as well. And so this team seems to be set on moving forward with Trae Young as their guy. It was something that I wasn't necessarily surprised about, but this has been the most definitive answer I believe we have heard from someone in the front office about Trae Young.
Yeah, we're locked in with Trae. And we talked last year, next season, we're just locked into next season, ready to move forward and be the best team that we could possibly be moving forward. And I think a lot of his leadership from last season went probably unnoticed to the common eye. Like, the way that he helped develop our young guys and make them better was significant. So, I mean, just continuing on with that and hopefully just making our team better.
Yeah, so they're moving forward with Trae Young being a part of this team. Now, of course, if you know the nitty gritty of everything, Trae has one more year on his deal, and then he has a player option. This is the time that you would be looking for an extension, and trying to get that information out of Onsi Saleh just wasn't going to happen. That is the one thing that I think people have to understand about a pre-draft press conference with your person in charge. In this case, it's Onsi Saleh, the general manager. Is that he is going to be as general as possible and as positive as possible. He does not want to give away too much heading into a draft where currently the Atlanta Hawks have two picks. They have one pick at number 13 and one pick at number 22. Now, I am of the opinion that the Atlanta Hawks don't want to take two players in this draft. Not because they don't think they can find two really quality players, because I believe this is also a very deep draft, and it's thrown off a lot of your normal insiders because all of the information that is normally presented this time of year, there are so many different ways that people are talking about how this draft is going to land. It's because there is a lot of really talented players that a lot of different teams have strong differing opinions about how this thing is going to all unfold. But the simple fact is the Atlanta Hawks are a really young basketball team, but their star is not getting any younger. He is in his upper 20s. And so this is the time that you want to capitalize on that ability. So being a young team is a good thing. I mean, you look at the Oklahoma City Thunder, who just won a championship. That's such a young team that when it came to popping champagne bottles for their celebration after winning a championship, they didn't know how to do it. They had to ask the old man of the group, Alex Caruso. So that just kind of shows you that youth is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think when presented with the opportunity to add veteran ability, veteran leadership to your locker room, and you have the picks to be able to make that happen, I think that is something that the Hawks would very likely want to entertain. It's also the simple fact of because of the way that the new CBA is set up, you don't want to have too many talented players around the same age because that means you have to pay them all at the same time. And as the first and second aprons start coming into play, this is when it's really messed with teams. So if you can look at some of the better teams around the league who have aging may be the wrong word, but they have older talent, veteran talent that is going to become more expensive that they're not going to be able to pay, that is something where you want to look at, hey, can we trade one of our younger assets, a 22nd overall pick maybe, and make something happen. I think that would be a very strong route for this Hawks team to go right now. I know that I have had Keith Smith of Spotrac on my show, the Dopey Millennial Show on 92.9 The Game, and he mentioned a guy like Luke Cornett with the Boston Celtics. That's a team that can't afford to pay everyone right now, and they also know, oh yeah, Jason Tatum not going to be around for us next season, so maybe we get rid of some talent while we can save some money and plan for a championship run, very likely the year after next. So those are the types of things you're dealing with when you're the Atlanta Hawks who have 13 and 22. There's also been some reports that maybe the Hawks take their two picks and they trade up. Maybe there's a team out there in that top 5, top 8 range that is young, needs more talent than just one pick in the first round. And because so many teams have so many differing opinions, as I mentioned, and the fact that maybe you would be better suited if you're a younger team to play the long game. And I know Hawks fans, they don't love hearing playing the long game. And I don't think a guy like Trae Young would appreciate that much either. And so that's why, for me, it makes the most sense that the Hawks look at either taking 13 and 22 to trade up and get what they believe is a better suited, better quality player, or that they take that 22nd overall pick and try to trade it, maybe package it with a player and turn it into something. Because a problem that the Hawks have had the last few seasons, I would say prior to Zach Ariza being the number 1 overall pick and his impact, where it led to him being a starter in year 1, is they've missed on draft picks. They don't have near the depth that they should right now because they either had a guy that decided he didn't want to play anymore, and AJ Griffin, they ultimately traded him to the Houston Rockets, or you have a guy like Kobe Buffkin that has stayed hurt so long that you're in year 3 and you still don't know what you have in your first round pick guard who was supposed to be a backup to Trae Young, and now it seems like is fitting more into a 2 guard type position. He doesn't want the ball in his hands. So because of all of this, like, you're behind in your development, quite honestly, of building out a roster. And so you need more surefire things, I think, a part of this team. And, you've got to find that either in the draft or going out and looking in free agency. This team has some ability to spend some money in free agency. It just isn't the best year to be doing that because there's not any guys that are necessarily blowing you away. I mean, I mentioned Luke Cornett being a name earlier that the Hawks could potentially look at. There have been some reports about them using this mid-level taxpayer exception, which, be honest with you guys, like, this is where you want to nerd out. Maybe you go somewhere else, but I'm gonna try to make it as layman's terms as possible. But Nikhil Alexander Walker from the Minnesota Timberwolves, him being someone that fits money wise potentially into your team and is a good enough quality player that he can make your team better. All of these sorts of things are what's going on right now. But when it comes to what the Hawks are looking at when drafting number 13, and if they also end up drafting number 22, or if they package those, trade up, all of those sorts of things. When it comes to draft philosophy, we don't necessarily know how Onsi Saleh thinks because we've never seen him be in the driving seat to make that selection. However, when he was asked at this press conference on Monday, this is how he approaches his draft philosophy.
When it comes to the draft, I always pick the best player available. Like, that's my philosophy. I don't believe in picking for a position. If there's a guy that makes sense for us, we're going to take him. And always the best player. That's the philosophy there.
All right, best player available. Now, I did have some people hit me up in my mentions and were like, well, isn't this what everyone says? Is that they're going for best player available? And yeah, most of the time, this is what your decision makers are going to say because it gives them cover. It gives them the ability to say, oh, well, we saw this guy as the best player on the board, and that's why we took him, even though maybe we already have a bunch of wings and you would think we don't need more wings, but we would rather get a guy who is extremely talented and make it all work instead of drafting a guy because we have a need and he ends up not turning into the type of player that we actually needed because he was either subpar or worse, potentially, in that bust category because we forced something. And so I think that is something to evaluate when you look at needs for what the Atlanta Hawks have right now, because I would say a big and a point guard are two of the biggest needs for this Hawks team heading into the season. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how they're going to go about addressing it, because if you take Onsi Saleh on his face as saying best player available is where we're going to go, I think that's how you end up in a situation where some of the names that I have seen out there being guys that the Atlanta Hawks should potentially take a look at. And there's a ton of names out there. And I don't necessarily like, you're going to have a differing opinion than I will about names, but I have four that have come across as far as being interesting, maybe somehow tied into something that the Hawks would want to do. And so I'm just going to present them to you and kind of explain why I think this is the type of player that the Hawks could be looking at. I'll start with, this has been by far when I have brought people that I would think are honestly smarter than me when it comes to the game of basketball and know their stuff, know their college hoops, know their international basketball, all of those sorts of things. When I have talked to people about, hey, who potentially could be available at 13 for the Atlanta Hawks, that would be a really quality player. Colin Murray Boyles out of South Carolina has been a name that's come up time and time again. This is a guy, he is a forward, which you might think, well, that's not necessarily something that the Hawks need, but I think his skill set is something that could make this Hawks team better. He's 6'6", 239 pounds, 20 years old, out of the University of South Carolina. I think the things that stand out are the fact that Colin tends to play through contact offensively, and scouts have even kind of pointed out the fact that he initiates that contact a lot of the time, and that's something that in the NBA you're going to be dealing with contact, and not everyone can handle that type of a situation. But I think with his frame on that 6'6" height, that's something that he can deal with. I think his ability to kind of score the basketball 1 or 2 feet, uh, the feet aspect matter and all of this sort of thing. That he has that balance ability and that scoring ability that certainly would be something pretty important. The IQ is the thing that I keep hearing comes back about Colin Murray Boyles time and time again, is that he has a high IQ. He just seems to think faster than everyone else on the floor. And don't you want that in a player on your team? Is the ability of, we see a guy like Trae Young, and the way that he makes reads and passes are just on a different level than anyone else. And so to have someone playing alongside Trae who also has that ability, someone who has the ability to switch, it feels like that's something that in today's NBA is growing more and more important, especially a guy who is, undersized to play that full, or not really undersized to play the forward position, but it would be undersized to be playing on a big. And yet it seems like what USC had him doing was playing on guarding fives a lot of the time. And so his ability to handle that makes you think that, okay, he doesn't necessarily fit the exact needs of this team, even though I think it does, but positionally, maybe when you think of those traditional elements of addressing a basketball team, he doesn't fit those needs. But I do think, as far as talent, ability, and likelihood that he potentially could be there at 13, Colin Murray Boyles is certainly a name that you would want to take pretty seriously. I think along the same lines, a guy who maybe positionally isn't going to be in the point guard or the center role, but is someone who, if he is there for you in the draft, I think you would have to take a real serious look at him, is Carter Bryant out of Arizona. This is a guy 6'6", a little bit leaner than Colin Murray Boyles. He's right around 215. But I think with the weight that he has, this is a guy who is strong, athletic, which you always want in the NBA, and especially with the Hawks, the way that they like to play fast, you need quickness, you need athleticism, you need 3-and-D potential. I think this is always something that you're looking to add. I know when you kind of look at a Zachary Rizachet, that was something that you knew you were going to get from him early on, but being the number 1 overall pick, you're hoping that can expand further apart from just being that element of his game. But I think with Carter Bryant out of Arizona, you get someone who is also a big time defender. And this Hawks team is going to continue to want to add strong defenders, and that side of the basketball being something that's really pretty important. I think someone who can switch maybe in a different way than a guy like Murray Boyles can switch. This for Carter Bryant would go up and through guards, through the forward position is something that's pretty important. And then having a guy outside of Dyson Daniels who could be a point of attack defender, I think is really pretty key. And that's why a guy like Carter Bryant keeps coming up as a potential name that the Hawks could be looking at with this draft. All right, I want to separate this from, those are a couple of names that fit, I think, talent-wise, what this team is looking for, but maybe not necessarily positionally. And I want to preface this with something that Onsi Saleh spoke to us reporters about, in the simple fact that his view of how the NBA, of how the game is played right now, is not on your traditional outlook. I asked Onsi Saleh, hey, look, we know how tall that Onyeka Okongwu is. We know how tall that Trae Young is. So this team is always going to be a little bit smaller as long as those two guys are starting. And so how do you help this team out by adding size? Or is size even something that's really important to add? And I found what Onsi Saleh had to say pretty interesting.
I think there are ways that you could build a team that you don't need traditional types of things. In the sense of, like, we do have some long athletic guys out there, which is really interesting for our defense and our play style moving forward. Yeah, when we get to that point in our season, and we'll address some things there, but I feel really good about a lot of our group moving forward. We are a very young group that is still developing, and I think that's important to realize here. But really excited for Onyeka. Really excited for Onyeka.
Yeah, so clearly Onsi Saleh is saying, I'm not just going to go get the 7-footer because we need size because the 7-footer is there. And it seems like in the traditional sense of how the game has been played, you need to go get that 7 foot tall type of player. I say all this to say because another name that keeps coming up for a potential option that the Atlanta Hawks could go and address their center position, but do it in a way that maybe hasn't necessarily uh, isn't the 7-footer way that we've seen other teams go out and address this, is Thomas Sorber out of Georgetown. This is a guy who is a big, but similar to Onyeka Okongwu, 6'9", 263 pounds. This dude is solid. I think the thing that he makes up for with being a shorter big is he's got a 7'6" wingspan. This guy can really stretch out. You think of those posters of that giant kind of wingspan element. Like, this is something that Thomas Sorber has, that even though he's not height-wise super tall, he can certainly still defend that 5 position based on that wingspan. I saw he's got a 9'1" standing reach. This is a guy who is massive, and playing with that big size, I think, not someone who is not too slow to play with this team, because as I mentioned earlier, like, I do think there are some names in this draft that would give you some cause for concern as to whether or not they could keep up with the type of speed that this Atlanta Hawks team is going to want to go with. But I think a guy like Sorber, who's 19 years old, in that 6'9", 263 frame, is going to be able to handle. His feet are really, really strong. And I think that's an important element, is someone who is not just going to get pushed around in the paint. It's been a problem that this Hawks team has dealt with. So having someone who is not necessarily tall man, but is big man, is certainly something that I think would benefit this Atlanta Hawks team. I think reaction time is certainly something that's important, and that's been an element that has been brought up when dealing with Sorber. And then I think using his frame to be able to hold out off defenders, like, that is an important element of all of this, of still having the flexibility to get around guys, but having a solid enough frame to be able to use that body and kind of throw it around. I think that is something that makes him not your traditional big, but still a big that would benefit this Hawks team. Then you can go into a guy who does fit the traditional big type of element, but I still think would be a benefit to this Hawks team, and that's Joan Berenger out of France. This is a 6'11", 19-year-old. Sound familiar? Yeah, I do think it would be very interesting, not just because Berenger is from France, and would obviously fit in with Zachary Rizachet and kind of give him some comfort. And I think when you have teammates that you're comfortable around, who knows what you can build and how quickly it can come together. But I do think there are some really positive elements about Berenger that make you think, okay, this is a guy who could fit along with Trae Young. The fact that I see him as having that speed, and someone who's talked about as being a rim runner, someone who is big size wise at 6'11", 235. He's got big hands. That means he has the ability to block shots, and go up and grab rebounds. Like, this is having a wide catch radius. I talked about Sorber having that big wingspan, but for Berenger having that big catch radius for him to be able to be fed passes in the paint certainly would be something that this Hawks team could use. Having a strong offensive rebounder, I think, would be a really positive element for this team coming off the bench, because this is what I would see for Berenger, especially initially. You never know necessarily how a player is going to bloom, but I think that's what, when you're talking about addressing the big position, Onyeka Okongwu, for everything that we understand, is going to be the starter moving forward. And so that's kind of where you when you're thinking about all of this, how you have to kind of consider it all. But I think Berenger is someone who maybe fits more in the traditional sense. And then I think the French aspect of it certainly doesn't hurt, of having some comfortability with a new teammate. It would help Berenger acclimate faster, and I think would help Rizachet of having just someone to have that shared experience with in the locker room, just in the same sense that an American from Duke having someone else who went to Duke would be able to share in that type of way. So it's all interesting elements to kind of consider as we approach this NBA draft. It's going to be very, very quickly approaching on Wednesday. 8 o'clock is when things are going to get started. It's certainly going to be interesting what the Hawks are able to do if they end up sticking with 13 and 22. Look, I mentioned 4 names, and Onsi Saleh said they looked at about 80 players up to, I think, all the way in the hundreds if you count some of the evaluations they did in Chicago. But Saleh mentioned the fact that he'd been flying all over the country and all over the states, going in all types of different gyms to get to evaluate players. And so there's going to be so many options, and optionality was certainly a term that Onsi Saleh used on Monday. There's so many different options for what this Hawks team can do, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see these first pieces if they end up drafting 13 and 22, and how that's going to affect what this team is going to do in free agency, because that'll be the next thing. The next time I talk to you guys, there will have been an NBA draft. The Hawks will have a new player or players, depending on what they decide to do. And then that will really kind of jumpstart our conversation into free agency and into what this Atlanta Hawks team is going to look like, come October when things really get tipped off. That's going to do it for my time here on Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson. Make sure you tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell whoever that this podcast now exists and is going to be a place that they can look to on a weekly basis during the off season, and then on a more regular basis during the regular season, as a way to acclimate ourselves with this new Atlanta Hawks team and what's going to happen moving forward. Until next time, see, first podcast already have some mess ups at the end, but until next time, guys, have fun and we'll talk soon.